The river didn't roar that morning. It whispered low and cold, dragging silt and secret things beneath its skin. Fog curled along the bank like a creature just waking up. A raven landed on a half-submerged branch, shook the frost from its wings, and waited, black eyes sharp. Something was coming. Or someone. June Coulter hit the water like a dropped rag doll. Her scream never made it past the rocks. The current caught her dress, tangled in it like it wanted to help her rise, then changed its mind. Her mouth filled with river and silence. Her arms flailed, then floated. Her stepmother's shadow, brief and sharp, vanished from the cliff above. No words, no prayers. Just the sound of a body slipping out of memory. She drifted. The fabric of her calico dress tore against jagged roots. One shoe floated away, the other stayed on. Its lace knotted with care that morning, the last thing she'd done for herself. Her breath came back in startled gasps between mouthfuls of ice. Then even that fled. Her vision turned white-blue, like winter sky through a window, and stayed that way. A man appeared when the river gave her up. Loda Greyhawk stood knee-deep in the shallows, brown cloak flapping against his thighs, the wind lifting his long black hair just enough to see his face. He did not shout or rush. He moved like someone who knew what dying looked like and didn't startle at the sight of it anymore. His moccasins gripped the muddy rock as he leaned in and took hold of her under the arms. Her limbs were stiff, but he moved them as if she were still a girl, not a burden. He didn't check for breath, just carried. Up the slope, past scrub and frost-bitten roots, to where his horse stood tied beside a leather saddlebag. He laid her across the blanket like she was folded laundry, not a stranger. Her eyes opened once in the ride back. All she saw was shadow and sky, and the smell of pine smoke clung to her nostrils like it wanted her to stay awake. She didn't. When she woke again, it was near firelight. The crackle was steady, low. Her skin burned at first. Then came the ache, the dull bruising along her ribs, her ankle, her right wrist. She flexed her fingers. They moved, which startled her more than pain. A tin cup sat near the coals. Steam twisted from it like a spirit. Behind it, the man, Apache, by the set of his jaw and the shape of his clothes, sat cross-legged, sharpening something that gleamed like a flattened crescent. Not a weapon. A carving blade. June blinked slowly. She made the mistake of trying to speak. Her throat scratched like raw cotton. He didn't move to help her. Just nodded toward the cup. She reached with her left hand. He watched her shake, didn't reach in. When her fingers finally closed around the tin, a small flicker of warmth lit his face. Approval, maybe. Or relief. She sipped. Bitter pine and something faintly sweet. Her stomach twisted, then calmed. You brought me here, she rasped. He nodded. I was in the river. Another nod. She swallowed, hard. You didn't have to. This time, he answered. Voice quiet, weathered. I was already there. She stared. The fire snapped and spit beside them. Outside, snow tapped against the glass of a single high window. Her dress was hung to dry. Her shawl lay folded over a chair, the frayed edge tucked in too neatly to be anything but his doing. I don't know your name, she said. He looked at her a moment longer than was polite. Lota. He didn't ask hers. She didn't offer. Not yet. She sipped again, then let the cup rest against her lips. Her heart beat too loud. She realized, slowly, that no one had called her by name in weeks. Not her stepmother, who only hissed orders. Not the man she'd been promised to. And not her father, who stood silent during it all, his eyes on the ground like it would tell him what was right. June had screamed when Mara shoved her. Not from pain, but betrayal. The kind that started as a hot crack in the chest, then turned cold as river water. Her voice shook. I was supposed to marry someone. Lota's knife stopped moving. He didn't look up. I said no. That was all. Still, he didn't interrupt. Then I was gone. She set the cup down. Her hands curled in her lap like winter birds. Loda rose, slow and tall, and took 2 steps toward the stove. He dropped a bundle of cedar shavings into the firebox, then used a stick to stir the coals. The light warmed the cabin into amber. On a shelf, small wooden carvings lined the back: birds, deer, something that looked like a cradleboard. June looked toward the door. "Will they come looking?" He didn't answer. She wasn't sure if it was because he didn't know or because he already had. She cleared her throat. "If they ask, you don't have to say I'm here." "You're not here," he said quietly, without turning. It took her a second. "Then where am I?" He faced her again, soft and slow. "Safe." That word hit her like a slap. Not because it was unkind. Because it was unfamiliar. Safe. She looked down at her palms. Bruised, cut. Hands that scrubbed floors, milked goats, stitched hems in silence. Not hands that anyone saved. Outside, wind bent the pine trees sideways, their branches groaning. The cabin didn't shake. Loda's fire held steady. He stepped past her and laid a wool blanket near the cot, then left the room without a word. The door shut quietly behind him. June sat still a long while. She listened. Not for danger, but for absence. There were no voices hissing from the walls. No boots pacing overhead. No ring slammed down on tables. Just the fire. She reached for the blanket and pulled it over her shoulders. Then she lay down and stared at the ceiling, tracing the knots in the wood with her eyes. She wasn't sure if Loda would let her stay. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. But the fact that she could choose just that felt like a new kind of warmth under her ribs. Sleep came slowly. Not from exhaustion. From unfamiliarity. It had been years since she slept in silence. The fire burned low. A storm rolled in from the north. Somewhere, in town, Mara Coulter told someone at Widow Beck's counter that her stepdaughter was ungrateful. That she ran off with nothing. That the good man she turned down would probably never marry now. "A shame," she said, fanning herself with the same hand that pushed June into the river. But the West remembers things. It remembers what gets buried in snow. It remembers who lights a fire for a stranger. And it remembers the shape a girl makes when she pulls herself back from the edge, not screaming, not proud, just quiet and breathing. For now. The snow thickened overnight, soft as sifted flour, layering the pines until the forest looked like a still life meant to be left untouched. When June opened her eyes, light filtered in through the single pane of glass, glowing gold against the frost-laced window. The fire was already lit. She hadn't heard Loda wake. She never did. The cabin smelled like cedar and something faintly sweet, corn mush, maybe, or honey tea. She shifted under the blanket and felt her muscles ache, not from cold anymore, but from returning. Her body, once dulled by obedience and survival, now quietly reminded her it was still hers. Loda sat near the stove with a small wooden bird in his hands. He was whittling again, same blade, same rhythm. He didn't look at her, but she felt his awareness settle over her like a second skin. He always knew when she stirred, and he never asked what she dreamed of. She sat up slowly. Her hair was tangled, her dress still smelled of river and fire smoke, but she pulled the shawl around her shoulders and stood. He didn't move. "I'll fetch water," she said softly. He nodded once. The bucket was already by the door, and the handle had been wrapped with a bit of wool cloth so it wouldn't freeze to her hand. She stepped outside, and the cold stung her throat, sharp as pine sap. The forest stretched wide around the cabin, silent, unjudging. The creek behind the trees still babbled beneath thin layers of ice. She filled the bucket and came back with fingers pink and proud. Loda met her at the door and took the weight without comment. They didn't speak over breakfast. He passed her a tin plate. She chewed slowly, each bite a small act of rebellion against the world that had once told her to be small and silent. In Loda's silence, she found something gentler, not dismissal, but space. Afterward, she followed him outside. Not because he asked. Just because she needed to. The blacksmith's shed stood half buried in snow, smoke curling from a vented roof. Inside, iron tools hung like ghosts waiting to be summoned. The heat was near unbearable, but she didn't flinch. She watched him work. Not the way men watched women, judging softness, shape, obedience, but the way people watched something unfamiliar that demanded respect. He moved with precision. Hammer. Fold. Quench. The rhythm was ancient. Not mechanical, but remembered in the bones. She didn't speak until the fourth spark flared off the anvil and danced past her boot. You don't ask many questions. He looked up briefly. His face was flushed from heat. Most people lie when asked. She held his gaze. And you don't? I lie when I need to, he said. But I know when others are about to. June leaned against the doorframe. Then you must have known I didn't plan to marry that man. I knew, he said simply. And yet you still brought me here. He turned the metal. It hissed in water. Because you were drowning. She didn't speak again for a long while. The wind outside stirred snow from the roof in slow whirls. A crow landed on a fence post and stared at her like it knew things it couldn't say. That afternoon, she cleaned the cabin. Not because she was expected to, but because she wanted the space to feel less like a stranger's life and more like breath. She folded her dress neatly. Washed the dried mud from her shawl. Brushed her hair with her fingers until it looked less like seaweed and more like June again. On a shelf tucked behind a folded buffalo hide, she found a cradleboard. It was small, stitched hide, worn wood, the leather faded from use. Inside, no child's weight. Just an old strand of black hair tied with blue thread. She didn't touch it. Just looked. That night, they ate by the fire again. She watched him more boldly now. The way he checked the latch twice before settling down. The way he stirred the pot without tasting. The way he sat with his back always near the wall. You lost someone, she said. It wasn't a question. Loda didn't flinch. Wife. Daughter. She waited, but he offered nothing else. It wasn't stonewalling. It was reverence. June lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. He looked at the flames. You didn't do it. They sat in silence. Later, when he went outside to feed the horses, she crept toward the shelf and laid her old silver thimble into the cradleboard, just a token, something from her own mother. Gone too long ago to cry over now. She didn't say why. She just did it. The next morning, Loda handed her a basket. You'll come to town. It was not a request. She blinked. Is that wise? You'll need supplies. Won't they see me? He looked at her evenly. Let them. She nodded. Not because she was brave. But because she was tired of hiding. They rode in slow. The sun cracked through the trees, melting the icicles on barn roofs. The streets of Stillwater were muddy slush and winter gossip. Heads turned as they passed. Loda's face gave away nothing. June kept her hood up and her eyes forward. At Widow Beck's dry goods store, the bell above the door jingled like it had forgotten how to be gentle. Beck squinted over her spectacles. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. June placed a jar of honey on the counter. A spool of thread. A box of matches. Looks like you found your tongue, the widow said dryly. June held her gaze. I've always had it. Just never had a place to put it. The widow sniffed. Well. You found something, all right. She handed her a wrapped bundle, but kept her fingers firm. Town's talkin'. You might as well know. June didn't pull away. Let them talk. They weren't there. Loda stepped forward, coin in hand. The widow took it without blinking. Outside, the sky began to dim. As they mounted up again, a small group stood across the street, Amos Rain among them, arms crossed, face smug as a butcher's block. He didn't call out. Just stared. Loda didn't look. He simply touched June's elbow, steadying her in the saddle. She didn't realize until that moment that she was shaking. Not from fear. From memory. The ride back was quiet. The snow came down again, soft, slow, forgiving. By the time they reached the cabin, the horses steamed like kettles. Loda unsaddled them without a word. June stood on the porch, watching the snow fill their boot prints behind them. She knew the silence wouldn't last. The town would keep speaking, even if she didn't. But she also knew something else. She was no longer the girl who'd been dragged to the altar by threat and promise. No longer the girl who waited for kindness like scraps under a table. The fire was lit when they entered. And this time, when Loda passed her a bowl, their fingers brushed. He didn't flinch. Neither did she. Outside, the west turned its face to winter. Inside, something gentler took root, quiet as breath, but steadier than snow. The next morning, the knock came. Not hard. Not loud. Just a steady 3 taps, too polite for threat, too deliberate for neighborly check-ins. Loda paused midway through slicing venison and set the knife down with care, like it might be needed again soon, but not for food. June turned from the stove, her hands damp with dishwater. Her heart dropped low and stayed there. Loda didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't need to. His presence alone had a weight to it, like stone sunk deep in river silt. He opened the door. Deputy Amos Raines stood on the porch with 2 men behind him and a smile like spoiled butter. "Didn't expect you to be the one opening doors around here," Amos drawled. "Heard rumors. Couldn't believe 'em. So I came myself." Loda said nothing. June wiped her hands and stepped forward, slowly. Amos tilted his head like a man trying to place a face he hadn't expected to see again. "Well, look at that," he said. "Alive after all. The West keeps its little miracles." June kept her spine straight. "You knew I was alive." "That's so," he said, all innocence and grin. "Your stepmother said you run off. Said she tried to keep you straight, but you were too wild to wed. Cried the whole town dry over it. She blinked once. She threw me into the river." The 2 men behind Amos shifted uneasily. One of them looked away. "That's a mighty bold claim," Amos said, taking a slow step forward onto the wooden slats. "From a girl no longer under her father's roof. Now living out here with a man who's not her kin." Loda moved then, not fast, but sure. He stepped between June and Amos, hands loose at his sides. "Not threatening. Just present." Amos chuckled. "Don't get riled. I ain't accusing anything. Just sayin' it's a strange look. Young woman shacked up with a widower from the nations, not more than a few weeks after vanishing. June's jaw trembled once. She stilled it. "I'm not shackled to anyone," she said evenly. "Least of all the man who tried to buy me." That landed. Amos's grin tightened. His voice lost its syrup. "You were spoken for." "I refused," she said. "You didn't listen." He turned to Loda. "You're harboring her. That's a crime, you know." Loda didn't blink. "I found her dying." "That's not the point." "It is," Loda said softly, "if you left her to die." The silence stretched. Amos's hand twitched near his belt, then thought better of it. "This'll go to the sheriff," he muttered. "You want it quiet, send her back." "She's not property," Loda said. Amos stepped back onto the snow and turned without another word. His boots left sharp marks all the way to the trees. Inside, the air didn't move. Loda closed the door gently, as if any sound too loud might shatter what little peace remained. He turned to her. "They'll come again," June said. He nodded. She folded her arms, stared at the worn floorboards. "I should go." "No." Her head jerked up. He looked at her, not as a protector or a man owed something, but like someone who knew what exile felt like. "You don't owe them silence." Her eyes burned. "But I might be the reason they come with rope." They come anyway, he said. Always looking for excuses. They bring their own fire. She stood still a moment longer. Then she nodded. Not in fear. In understanding. That night, she dreamed of her mother. She couldn't remember the sound of her voice, but she remembered hands rough from kneading bread, soft when they braided her hair. She woke with tears that didn't feel sharp. Just old. They rode into town again the next morning, not because they needed to, but because the story couldn't stay hidden forever. June wore her hair down. Not pinned. Not hidden. She walked beside Loda, not behind him. People watched from porches, through windows, behind barrels of feed. Widow Beck stepped out from her shop and crossed her arms like she was expecting company. You picked a bad time to be seen, she muttered as they passed. I wasn't hiding, June replied. I was healing. Beck's brows rose. Healing turns to talking fast in this town. And talk leads to trouble. I know, June said. That's why I came to start it myself. At the sheriff's office, June walked in before Loda could open the door. Sheriff Braith wasn't there. Only Amos. He looked up from behind the desk like a snake caught sunning too long. Well. Thought you'd scurried back to the hills. I came to file a statement, she said, stepping forward. Attempted murder. Name's Mara Coulter. Amos stood, laughed thin and bitter. That's a heavy word, miss. She tried to drown me. There were bruises on my arms. You saw them. Circumstantial. I was in the river for hours. Ask the doctor. No witnesses, he said. I am the witness, she said quietly. And I'm not afraid of your smile anymore. Loda stepped beside her. He didn't need to speak. The pressure in the room thickened. Finally, Amos sat down, real slow. He tapped a pencil once, twice. You'll need more than words. June nodded. Then I'll get them. They left the office, boots crunching down the steps. What now? Loda asked. We find the truth, she said. And say it out loud. The snow had stopped. But the sky hung low and heavy, like it was waiting to decide which side of the story it believed. The snow had turned crusted and hard by the time word spread through Stillwater that June Coulter intended to speak at the church hall. It wasn't a formal gathering. No invitations had been sent. But gossip moved faster than trains in a town like this, and by sunset, lanterns glowed from every window, casting gold halos over the benches and pews, the old bell tower looming quiet above like a judge with no tongue. June stood just outside the doors, breath clouding in the cold. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her shawl, one stitch unraveling like a thread that could undo her. Behind her, Loda said nothing, his steady presence the only anchor she trusted more than fear. He wore his leather coat and the small carved medallion that hung over his chest, weathered with time. His eyes scanned the crowd through the cracks in the door. You don't have to do this, he murmured. I do, she said. If I don't speak, she wins. He didn't nod. He just stayed. Inside, the crowd was already thick. Widow Beck sat in the back, her hands folded over a basket of peeled apples. Sheriff Braith leaned against a pillar, face unreadable. Amos Raine stood near the front, arms crossed, jaw tight. And Mara Coulter, dressed in her Sunday gray, hair pinned neat, sat dead center, lips pursed like she was tasting vinegar. The doors opened, and the room hushed like breath drawn too sharp. June walked in. She didn't take the pulpit. She didn't need elevation to be heard. She stepped onto the floor, where the lantern glow cast soft gold on her face and caught in the curls of her undone hair. She looked younger than she was. And older than anyone there. I don't come here to accuse, she began, voice quiet but clear. Not in the way this town likes its accusations, sharp and sudden, like gossip wrapped in prayer. A few in the back murmured, and someone shifted on a wooden bench. I came because I nearly died. And no one noticed. She took a breath. Her voice steadied. You all knew I didn't want to marry Amos Raine. I said no. Some of you heard me say it. She looked toward the back at Widow Beck, who lowered her eyes. And when I disappeared, not one of you came asking. Mara told you I'd run off. And you nodded, because that was easier to believe than the truth. Because a girl running sounds rebellious. A girl drowning sounds like a tragedy someone might be blamed for. Mara's face twitched, just once. I didn't run. She pushed me. Into the river. Into the cold. Into silence. She paused. The wind outside whispered under the church eaves like it too had something to say. I would have died. Should have, maybe. But I didn't. Someone found me. Pulled me out without asking what I'd done to deserve saving. Gave me fire, food, and a name I could answer to again. June turned slightly, not to look at Loda, but to be near his quiet strength. I came back here not for justice, she said, but for truth. So you can't pretend anymore. So when you see me on the street, you'll remember I lived. Not just survived. Lived. The room held still. Sheriff Braith's mouth parted, as if to speak, but it was Mara who stood. That man, she pointed to Loda, kept you like property. You were a girl with no standing, no name. And now you think standing here makes you something righteous? I don't think I'm righteous, June said calmly. I think I'm breathing. That's enough. You're ungrateful, Mara hissed. I took you in when no one else would. You took me in, June agreed, and waited until I could speak, then taught me not to. A sharp murmur spread like a brush fire. Amos stepped forward, red-faced. This ain't a court. What do you want, June? Revenge? A show? I want to live without fear, she said. That's not revenge. The sheriff raised a hand. Enough. His voice carried. This town don't settle things in one night. But we hear what's said. And if even half of it's true, he looked at Mara, then at Amos. Then we've all got things to reckon with. Mara turned as if to leave, but Widow Beck rose in the back. I saw her, Beck said. That morning. Mara at the river. Wet hem. No grief. Silence sliced through the room. Beck shrugged. Didn't say nothin'. But I knew. And I didn't want to get involved. Mara's face paled. You involved now, said someone in the crowd. Loda stepped forward finally, not to defend June, but to stand beside her visibly, openly. She chooses her own name, he said. Her own home. The sheriff didn't argue. That night, the crowd broke slowly, like ice thawing under reluctant sun. Whispers trailed through the streets. But not all whispers carried malice. Some carried warning. Some carried awe. Back at the cabin, June unlaced her boots by the fire. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just reached for the cradleboard shelf, placed a small pine carving beside the hair braid, and looked at Loda. Thank you, she said. Not for saving her. For letting her save herself. He nodded once. Outside, the forest didn't stir. But the west, that old wide listener, leaned in, remembering. The wind had changed. It came down from the ridges sharp and sudden, tossing pine needles across the path like confetti for something unholy. The horses were uneasy, their hooves leaving broken prints in the snow as Loda led them out to the edge of the property. He felt it in the stillness, the way animals held breath before a storm. Something was coming. And it would not knock this time. Inside the cabin, June sliced dried apples into a pot of oats. Her hands were steady, but her chest thudded with the quiet dread of knowing too much. She hadn't slept fully in 2 nights, not from nightmares, but from a feeling. The west had grown watchful again, like it did before things were stolen. When the first crack of rifle fire split the air, the pot shattered on the floor. Loda was already moving. He shoved open the door, grabbed the long rifle from the frame. Stay low. June crouched, breath caught in her throat, a sliver of iron from the broken pot nicking her palm. Blood beaded slow and red. A second shot rang out, closer. Someone had come through the trees. She moved to the back wall, pulled the small blade he'd given her weeks ago, the one she'd kept hidden under the mattress like a secret prayer. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from memory. Mara had said, "You make your bed, lie in it." June had. And now she was rising from it. Outside, voices shouted. Loda's rifle cracked once, clean. Then came Amos's voice, loud, oily, full of authority he didn't deserve. "You've harbored a criminal, Greyhawk. By settler law, that's aiding and abetting." Loda shouted back, "She's a witness. You're the crime. Come out and let her speak to the courts if she's so full of truth." June stood slowly. Her eyes went to the firelight dancing in the window, casting shadows that trembled like breath. Her voice came quiet. "They'll never let me speak." Loda glanced at her once, then back toward the trees. "Then you have to make them hear." Outside, snow had begun again, gentle, traitorous. It softened boot prints but didn't hide them. 4 men now, maybe 5. One she recognized, Jed Halloran, a rancher with debts and too many years open to bribes. Loda fired again, warning this time. "You want a war? Or the truth?" Amos stepped into view. Rifle slung low. "You think she's worth all this?" June stepped out behind Loda, blade in her hand, braid over her shoulder. "I do." Amos blinked. "You stay back." "I already did," she said, voice cutting through the snow like steel. "I stayed back while my father ignored me. I stayed back when you claimed me like cattle. I stayed back when Mara tried to drown me. And now? Now I speak." He raised the rifle. "You take one more step." But she didn't. She looked past him, to the men he brought. "You know what happened," she said, voice quiet now, but no less sharp. "You all heard. She pushed me. He covered for her. And I lived." Jed hesitated. "This ain't our business, June." "It became your business the moment you stood beside a man who sells lies and calls them law." Loda stepped forward then, between her and Amos. Not to block her, but to stand with her. "Enough blood's been spilled," he said. "Go." Amos spat into the snow. "You think she's safe now?" "The sheriff's tied. The courts are slow. But the people here, they listen to old names. Old alliances." June's jaw set. "Then let them listen to a new one." She turned toward the porch. Opened the cedar chest that had belonged to Loda's wife. Inside, the ribbon from her mother's bonnet, the thimble, the carving he'd made of her, and the old, rolled marriage blanket. She held it out. Loda paused. "You sure?" She looked him in the eyes. "I'd rather choose in the cold than be handed off in a church built by threats." They stood on the porch as the snow fell between them, wrapped the blanket around their shoulders, and stood together, silent, solid, undeniable. Amos's rifle wavered. Jed stepped back. Then another. Mara emerged from the woods, her hair undone, eyes wide with something like disbelief. "You think this will save you?" she hissed. "You think anyone will call that a marriage?" June met her eyes. "No. But they'll call it peace. And that's more than you ever gave me." Mara lunged, but Loda's voice cracked like a whip. "Go home, Mara. If you still have one." She stopped. Wind tore across the trees. Then, slowly, Mara turned and vanished into the white, swallowed by the west that always knew where to bury shame. The others followed, one by one. No bullets. No blood. Just retreat. Silent, unfinished, but enough. Loda lowered his rifle. June leaned against the porch beam, exhaling years she hadn't known she was carrying. "You're not afraid," he said softly. "I am," she whispered. "But not of them anymore." Later, after the horses were fed and the fire crackled clean and strong, June knelt before the hearth and placed the blanket gently across both their chairs. Loda watched her, something unreadable in his eyes. You saved yourself, he said. She shook her head. No. You let me. He moved closer. I'd do it again. You already did. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying the footsteps of the men who came to claim her and left with nothing. And in the quiet afterward, the cabin didn't feel like a place she had landed. It felt like a place she had chosen. If you've ever been cast out, called shame, or told you belong to silence, know this: there are fires still burning in quiet places. Men who listen without taking. And blankets wrapped by choice, not duty. The West watches who you become after the river. And it remembers. Always.